Welcome to everybody. Very good to see so many tuning in. And I'm delighted to introduce Professor AJ Berkovitz. AJ is a scholar of antiquity who writes about Jewish text traditions and history from the formation of the Hebrew Bible until the rise of Islam. And he received his doctorate in Religions of Mediterranean Antiquity from Princeton. His first book, A Life of Psalms in Jewish Late Antiquity, received a Jordan Schnitzer First Book Publication Award from the Association for Jewish Studies. He's the co-editor of Rethinking Authority in Late Antiquity, Authorship, Law, and Transmission in Jewish and Christian Tradition, and the author of many academic publications and public-facing essays. His recent article in the Association of Jewish Studies Review, Psalm 45, Between Abraham and Jesus, was awarded the 2021 CRINT Prize Essay. And AJ was a Starr Fellow at Harvard and is now currently teaching at Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion. And this evening, or actually for me it's the evening, but I'm sure it's the morning elsewhere, wherever you are, what AJ is going to be addressing us with is Beyond Exegesis in the Cultures of Ancient Jews and Early Christians. So over to you, AJ.
Thank you so much. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Hello, world. I'm truly honored and excited to be presenting in this forum. So really thank you for having me, and I'm looking forward to a fun, let's call it an hour together. Let me share my screen and put it in presenter mode. Okay, can everyone see? Excellent. All right. So the title of my talk today is Beyond Exegesis, the Psalm Cultures of Ancient Jews and Early Christians. It's based on the book, which you see to the left, A Life of Psalms in Jewish Late Antiquity, and it's going to weave together some of the strands of arguments therein. So let's begin. And let's begin by unpacking a central word in this title. And by that, I mean Psalm cultures. What do I mean by Psalm cultures? By Psalm culture, I mean the deep encounter with and pervasive use of Psalms by religious Jews and Christians in the modern period and earlier. In short, what I'd like to do today is to give everyone here a set of Psalm-tinted glasses. Once you put them on, you will truly begin to see Psalms, its impact and influence everywhere you start to look. But before beginning in the ancient period, which I want to focus most of my talk, let's begin with somewhere close to modernity. And we're actually going to riff off the title of this august space, the Oxford Interfaith Forum. And I want to begin with this man right here, who myself, and I'm sure other scholars, I know other scholars, would account as one of the most important philosophers in Jewish history. It's none other than Moses Mendelssohn. I think no one here will doubt Moses Mendelssohn's intellectual and exegetical chops. Moses Mendelssohn's dates are September 6th, 1729 to January 4th, 1786. And what we're going to be reading together is a snippet of a letter that Moses Mendelssohn sent to Sophie Becker, a non-Jew, and hence the Oxford Interfaith Forum. Sophie Becker was an up-and-coming poet who asked Moses Mendelssohn that famous question that this philosopher usually gets: how does one reconcile philosophy and theology, right? How do you be serious but still spiritual? What's important about this letter, as all letters, is its context. It's written December 27th, 1785. And if you look back to the left of the screen, you'll notice that Mendelssohn dies just about 2 weeks later. This is probably one of Mendelssohn's final, if not final, letter that he's ever written. The content's important because of what's going on in Mendelssohn's life at the moment. He is not only sick physically, he is also mentally weary. A couple of years prior, Mendelssohn's best friend, Lessing, who he adored, loved, and spent quite a bit of time with, was accused, in Mendelssohn's eyes, falsely, of that worst crime ever, and that is atheism. Mendelssohn spent his waning hours and energy trying to combat that claim and resuscitate the reputation of his best friend. So with that in mind, let's read a snippet of this letter, which begins our process of thinking beyond exegesis. And so this is what Mendelssohn tells Sophie Becker. You say that the philosopher does not pray, or at least not out loud, not with singing, but rather at most in his thoughts. Of course, that's what a good philosopher does. I would once again recommend to you my translation of the Psalms, if this would not betray too much the frailty of an author. This much is certain: the Psalms have sweetened many a bitter hour for me, and I pray and sing them as often as I feel the need in me to pray and sing. And given this rather dreary context towards the end of Mendelssohn's life, one can easily imagine that was quite often, right, the use of Psalms for Mendelssohn as a true emotional support. But we need not focus on high intellectuals, both Jews and Christians, to appreciate the vastness of Psalm culture. Let me riff on the other part of our workshop's title, and that's the Oxford part of it. What you see in front of you is a snippet from the Bodleian Library. It's MS Tanner 407 from the 16th century, and it's the commonplace book of Robert Reynes of Ackley, whose dates are 1445 to 1505. The book contains a lot of miscellaneous information, but what we're going to focus on is actually a recipe to make ink. I will not trouble your ears with my reading of Middle English. Instead, I will read Modern English. To make black ink, take gulls, copperas, and gum arabic. On the morning, take the gum water and the powder of gulls, mix them together and put them over fire and let it simmer for as long as it takes to say the psalm, Miserere me Deus, right? So we're not, no egg timers, no counting in your head. How does this, what is one commonplace way of just reckoning time? Well, say a psalm, say a really important psalm. That's how long it takes for the mixture to simmer. It's sort of moved from the sort of high and lofty to the sort of really everyday routine. These are going to be the two sort of pillars of psalm culture that we're going to see originate already in late antiquity. But just to continue moving on, most of these examples come from the early modern period, but here I did some surfing on Google last night, and here are some modern, very, very modern examples of what I'm calling the psalm culture again. Vintage psalm stickers, a psalm amulet, mini psalm books. These are pervasive. For myself, personally, I first encountered a psalm culture in my youth. My mother, may she rest in peace, was among those people who would read the book of Psalms from cover to cover every single week. She'd either do it in in Yiddish, which was her native tongue, or in English, her adoptive tongue, but she would do it every single day. As a teenager, I started to notice this happen. It's like, okay, what's going on? Why is my mom reading this book over and over and over again? It must be awesome. It must be like Harry Potter. Actually, I think that. But so I decided to finally read the book of Psalms, cover to cover, like my mother. And I was absolutely stunned. It was among the most awful things I've ever read. There are poems that are truly wonderful and truly magnificent. Psalm 23, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. Total gem, absolute. But there are other poems in the book that make literally no sense. An example of that is Psalm 68, which is so incoherent that I actually find among the better possible answers to what's going on here is by William Foxwell Albright, who suggests that each verse is actually an incipit for another whole different psalm. But in addition to its obscurity, the Psalms were also highly repetitive. I mean, how many times can I read, listen to the voice of my supplication, or save me from my enemy? You read the book cover to cover and you think that the book was, at least its poet was kind of paranoid. There are complete verses that repeat. In one instance, there's almost a complete psalm that's 14 and 54, 14 that are absolutely similar. So as a teenager, I found this book incredibly boring, which to me raised the questions: when, how, and why does this book matter so much to so many people? When, how, and why did a psalm culture come into being, right? So if I, perfect teenager with brilliant insight, thought this book was utterly dreadful, then why is the world wrong? Good teenage logic. So I then began to think about, the ancient period. And it really is truly popular, the question of when, how, and why, or at least the when parts. In antiquity, Psalms really does appear to be the most cited and commented book of the Bible by both the rabbis and the church fathers. The image to your left is the front cover of a rather newish book called the Scripture Index to Rabbinic Literature. I didn't counted, but if you can actually look at a little bit of a comparative analysis, there are 57 pages of quotations or citations of quotations from Psalms versus Genesis, which is 52, Song of Songs, 5 pages. If you use BibleIndex, which catalogs citations of biblical literature among church fathers, between the years 1 and 650 CE, you get another whole different perspective. Psalms, once again, super popular at 53,000, followed by Matthew, and then Genesis and John and others. So I saw, okay, Jews and Christians, rabbis in particular, and church fathers in particular, found the Psalms absolutely central. So it must be the case that Psalms became pervasive because what it had come to mean for exegesis. This is the cover of Bible as It Was, which I think in high school or early college was one of the books that truly and deeply influenced me. And it's really a primer on how to read, at least for the Second Temple and Rabbinic Exegesis. And I was convinced, why are Psalms popular? Why does the Psalm culture exist? Because of exegesis, because of interpretation. And to really smooth over matters quickly, it seemed obvious for Jews. Psalms became important in part because of what it taught Jews about David and David's life. Not a psalm can go by without some sort of comment, in the rabbinic tradition at least, that tethers the book to David and his history. For Christians, of course, it was obvious to me. Psalms became really important because it became thoroughly identified with Jesus, with Christology, with the history of Christianity, as early as the New Testament, Psalm 22 being super famous for it, Eli, Eli, lama azavtani, my Lord, why have you forsaken me? So it seemed obvious. Psalms became, a psalm culture developed and became pervasive because of David and because of Jesus. Except, not really. I thought once again about my mother, and I realized that she was reading these texts, Psalms in particular, but she wasn't exegeting every passage. It wasn't, Ashrei ha'ish asher, oh yes, this is David when. There was something else going on. I started to figure the interpretation of Psalms is a necessary feature of the popularity and pervasiveness of Psalm culture, but it is not exhaustive. It is necessary, but not sufficient. It's when in graduate school that I first started to realize and to discover a whole new way of thinking about scripture and a whole new way of thinking about unpacking sacred text. And this is the other part of my title, part of the title that I mean beyond exegesis, right? Beyond mere interpretation towards what? Towards something akin to reading practices, namely, what is reading, how does it work, and upon what is reading contingent? And I came to the conclusion, which is part of the core of my book, that the act of making meaning from a sacred text may rely on more than exegesis and its intellectual underpinnings. The reading and reception of a biblical text may also be inflected by, among other things, materiality and performativity. And I'd like to spend the rest of our time together, or at least in this presentation, unpacking those two other dimensions of the development of psalm culture, the materiality and the performativity, right? Think Mendelssohn, performativity, and also the ink recipe, but I like the ink recipe also because it sort of nods to the creating of ink to write texts. It's materiality. Let's begin with materiality. It's important for us to think about materiality as a kind of technology, something that can shape patterns in thought and practice. And everyone, for a moment, picture in your head a book. Well, your basics, go to the library, pull up a shelf, read the book. I read books all the time. It's, as do you, it's a hazard of the job. I love absolutely nothing more than footnotes. If I'm reading a book, I'm looking at its pages, I go down, there's a footnote, I read it, it's perfect. If I'm reading a scholarly text, if there are footnotes, I'm more likely than not to read the footnotes. Publishers hate footnotes. They despise footnotes, in part because it increases production costs, it increases the size of a book. Publishers love endnotes. If there's endnotes in a book, if it's central to my argument, I'll read it. It's fine. And it's not terribly difficult, right? The notion of an endnote is predicated on a particular kind of technology of a book, namely the fact that books can flip pages, right? You can keep your hand on the main text and flip easily back and forth to the endnotes. So it's annoying. I'm not likely to read endnotes unless I have to, but I'll do it. The nightmare comes when I'm reading a document that has endnotes on my computer, because now I'm stuck with the scroll problem. I can either, like a mad person, scroll up and down, up and down, up and down, or more likely I have to open up two different tabs, align them, and then read across. The author's argument has not changed. The text has not changed, but the material medium by which I encountered it has fundamentally shaped the way that I engage with this text and the way and the meanings that I produce from it. What's true of the modern period for me is also true of the ancient world for Jews and Christians. Most Jews, until the 8th century or so, encountered scriptural text in one format and one format only, and that's the scroll. The scroll is great. It's better than remembering things out loud. It's better than oral memory, but it has both opportunities and some deep limitations, especially with regards to Psalms. The textual history and material history of Psalms during the Second Temple period is actually quite complicated. We can talk about it in the Q&A, but for now I want to focus on the Rabbinic period, on late antiquity, where the Book of Psalms likely did exist and circulate as a series of 5 different scrolls. In fact, the numbers here are hypothetical reconstructions based on the books of Psalms and based on the content of Psalm scrolls at Qumran. What's important about this particular chart is that for most casual readers, for most humans, a text that is longer than 20 to 30 feet becomes really difficult to carry and really difficult to just casually read through. A full set, a complete set of Sefer Tehillim, the Book of Psalms, in scroll format would be about 1/3 the heft of a modern Sefer Torah, which is a lot. Massive texts did exist. They were often monumental. Think of Egyptian Book of the Dead or Samaritan Pentateuch, but they really, or even the modern Torah service, but they weren't a text that you took off a library and read through. So for Jews, Rabbinic Jews and Jews in late antiquity, they likely encountered the Book of Psalms not as a single book, but as a collection of scrolls. This provided for Jews both opportunities and limitations. Let's take a look at one, and this is an opportunity, and that's indexicality. Right? The division of the Psalms, the material division of Psalms into 5 books, encouraged the theological division of the Psalms into 5, which allowed Jews, some Jews, to make interesting connections. We find one such connection in the beginning of Midrash Tehillim, a rabbinic commentary on the Book of Psalms. It claims, one finds that whatever Moses did, so did David. It gets a whole list. Among the list is the follows. Moses gave them, Israel, 5 books of Torah, and correspondingly, David gave them the Book of Psalms, which was 5 books in it. And then the Midrash then lists the incipits of each book. So why are there 5 scrolls or 5 books of David? Well, there are 5 books of Torah, and David is Moshe renewed, according to the logic of this Midrash. Of course, scrolls then also provided some limitations. And one of those limitations was referentiality. And we can see that pretty clearly through this particular rabbinic commentary that's found in Genesis Rabbah, which is a commentary on the book of Genesis. It reads as follows. Rabbi Pinchas said in the name of Rabbi Ruvain, David asks God to arise 5 times in the first book of Psalms. Arise, Lord, saving my God. Arise, Lord, in your anger. Arise, Lord, lift up your hands. Arise, Lord, let no man prevail. Arise, Lord, confront him. God said to him, David, my son, even if you ask me to arise 1,000 times, I will not arise. When will I arise? When you see the poor oppressed and the needy sighing, as it is written, from the oppression of the poor ones and the sighing of the needy, now, ata, I will arise, says the Lord. There's a lot to unpack in the logic of this particular hermeneutical text. We're not going to do that. What I'd like us to do is to appreciate how the Book of Psalms is referenced here. 5 times in the first book of Psalms. It's kind of curious because the rabbis are completionists. They often will cite every example of something. And indeed, there are other examples across the corpus of Psalms where one can see Kuma Adonai, or at least Kuma Elohim. A good example is rise up, O Lord, and go up to your resting place, or rise up, O God, and judge the earth. Rise up, O God, plead your case. Why are these examples not part of the interpretation? And note, interestingly, the scribe of the British Museum manuscript actually includes Psalm 132:8 against the logic of the actual hermeneutics. I would argue that the limitations, the material limitations of the scroll actually shaped the exegetical implications of the Book of Psalms in this particular instance. Rabbi Pinchas and Rabbi Reuven only cite the first book of Psalms because the only text they probably had available to them at the moment was the first book of Psalms. It's sort of a myth to think that all rabbis had all of Bible memorized cold. Sort of piety sources like this begin to militate against that presumption. So for Jews and for the rabbis, particularly who are encountering the Psalms as a series of scrolls, right, that materiality has shaped the way they understand, interpret, and view the text. The picture changes when we look at some of our early Christian sources. For Christians, as we can see in this image by St. Augustine, they were no longer just using the scroll, but you can also see a brand new technology that Jews didn't adopt until well until the Middle Age, or until the beginning of the Middle Ages, and that's the codex, right? The ability for a book to go flip. It also allowed more text to be constrained in a smaller space. With a codex, you can now actually get an entire book of Psalms in one single volume. It's this material background that helps frame one of Augustine's final comments in the Book of Psalms. And this is from Augustine's commentary, Psalm 150. Now, in that some have believed the Psalms are divided into 5 books, they have been led by the fact that so often at the end of the Psalms are the words, so be it, or amen, amen. But when I endeavored to make out the principle of this division, I was not able. For neither are there 5 parts equal to one another, neither in quantity of contents, nor yet even in the number of Psalms, so as for each to contain 30. We, however, following the authority of the canonical scripture where it is said, for it is written in the book of Psalms, know that there is but one book of Psalms. For Augustine, who is regularly encountering the book of Psalms as a codex, for him it makes literally no sense that there are 5 different books here. Of course there's one book here. And if a book were to have divisions, those divisions need to be ordered. They need to be arranged. They need to be logical. Augustine here actually goes on to say, well, if you're going to divide the book, it should be divided into 50, 50, 50, because now we can combine the concept of the Jubilee with the concept of the Trinity. And indeed, Cassiodorus, who's living in Rome under Visigoth rule, actually encourages his monastery to have a single volume of the Psalms as a reference volume, and then for the monks under his care to have 3 volumes of 50 poems each. The movement of Psalms into a codex format also encouraged new ways of organizing and arranging the Psalms. What you have here is a piece of a manuscript of a psalm table from Eusebius of Caesarea. Eusebius is famous for a whole host of reasons, one of which is his real interesting drive to organize material. More famously, Eusebius has developed the canon tables, which allowed readers to cross-reference various gospel stories. Eusebius did the same thing for Psalms. Right? Once you can regularly flip through the book, you're encouraged to then make these clear canonical, in his view, canon divisions between, well, this is a Psalm of David, this is a Psalm of Solomon, these are unlabeled, this is a Psalm of Solomon. You can begin to arrange and to group the texts in ways that the organized order of a scroll would militate against. So that's materiality, one dimension of a psalm culture in late antiquity. It goes hand in hand with another. And for now, I want to turn to performativity, by which I mean the practice of psalms in liturgy, piety, and magic. In other words, these are sort of the everyday ways, the quotidian ways in which Jews and Christians contributed to and participated in a psalm culture. Among early Christians, we actually more visibly see psalm piety, or at least easily, among the desert monks. In the ancient world, right, monks would recite Psalms seriatim as part of their liturgy. We'll see a source soon where they repeat Psalms again and again as an act of piety. And if you read monastic texts, including the most famous, which is the life of St. Anthony, you can see that Psalms are used as anti-demonological weapons. Cite a psalm, banish a demon. The image in front of you is actually pretty interesting because it might show the imbrication of all 3. These are the incipits, the beginnings of the Septuagint, Psalm 51 and 93, that are drawn on the wall of a cave. And this is actually cave T8 at Jabal al-Tarif, which is the location of the discovery of the Nag Hammadi codices. The Nag Hammadi codices, I'm not going to get into it now, were hugely foundational in transforming the study of early Christian history. The Orthodox so-called church fathers talked about all those heretics. The Nag Hammadi codices, among others, gave voices, textual remnants and voices to those other opinions. Okay, let's take a look at one source, one example of performativity in a monastic context. And this is the source on the left. And this is from the Sayings of the Desert Fathers, which is sort of a guidebook written by monks, for monks, about how to be monkish. And the text reads as follows. Abba Lucia said, I will show you how, while doing my manual work, I pray without interruption. I sit down with God, soaking my reeds, plaiting my ropes, and I say, God, have mercy on me. According to your great goodness and according to the multitudes of your mercies, save me from my sin. One of the central tensions in the life of a monk in monastic literature is that between work and prayer. You're supposed to be working, but you're also supposed to constantly be praying. In this little snippet, Abba Lucius, or at least the editor who collates the text of Abba Lucius and shows it to other monks, wants to give a paradigm for what one can do. Right? You can plait your ropes, and you could recite as a mantra again and again and again a particular verse from Psalms. Right? It's a way of shaping the soul while working with one's hands. I like this text not only because, or I brought this text, not only because it sort of illustrates concretely one vector of some piety among the monastic community, but because it begins to provide a window into rethinking the relationship between Jews and Christians, Judaism and Christianity in late antiquity. When we typically talk about Jews, Christians in the Bible in the ancient world, and to some degree the medieval world, and my chair, I'm sure, has a lot to say about this, it's often in terms of polemic and invective. The Jews claim this text means X, Christians will claim it means Y. Jews claim that this psalm is about Jesus. Christians claim Psalm 45 is about Jesus, and then Jews say, no, it's really about Abraham. That's a hat tip to the article that was recently published of mine in the Association for Jewish Review. What a focus on performativity helps uncover is some of those interesting shared dimensions between Jews and Christians that move beyond learned exegesis and learned polemic. And to exemplify that, as one of several examples in my book, let's look to the right, which is a passage from the Palestinian Talmud. Rabbi Hezekiah, Rabbi Jacob Bar Achan, Rabbi Yassa said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, really this verse should never move from your lips. The Lord of hosts is with us, the God of Jacob is our refuge, Selah. Rabbi Yossi, the son of Rabbi Abu and Rabbi Abahu, in the name of Rabbi Yochanan and the colleagues, the Lord of hosts is with us. Fortunate are those who trust in us. These rabbinic sages are encouraging a similar kind of practice towards piety as the Christian monks. Right? There are a few verses, inevitably in this case from Psalms, and there are others also from Psalms that one recites again and again and again and again and again as a mantra to shape one's soul. Even in comparison, and even in comity, there's also a little bit of difference. I find it interesting to note that the Christian text, in this case and in others through the book, the verses that are highlighted tend to focus on mercy and sin. Those verses highlighted as part of pietistic practice by rabbinic sources tend to focus on faith in God, refuge. It might go back to a shared perspective, but a different anthropology, namely, what is the purpose of piety? But we can talk about that another time. I also bring this Palestinian text because it shows how the boundaries, as for the monks, between what we might call liturgy, magic, and piety are really truly blurred, if extent at all, for both Jews and Christians. Let's take a look at the next slide. Among our what we might call magical sources in the ancient world, amulets, magic bowls, the Psalms are absolutely well represented. For both Jews and Christians, the Psalms are ever present in their use as ritual power to secure health, to banish demons, to encourage and breed success in general. Instead of sort of giving everyone here a sundry list, I'd like to focus in on one example And this is a Jewish Palestinian Aramaic silver amulet from Tiberias. That's this right here. This silver text would have likely been rolled up and worn. This isn't a Jew, this is a mummy portrait from Imperial Egypt, but you see that over there around the boy's neck is a cylindrical tube that likely contained not this exact amulet, of course, but something like this amulet. If we zoom in further around here, we would read the text as follows. Eradicate from the body of Ina, daughter of Zeirti, all severe fever and sickness and illness, in the name of the Lord who is enthroned on the cherubim. Amen, amen, Selah, blessed is he. The Lord of hosts is with us. The God of Jacob is our refuge, Selah. Right? I hope this verse by now rings a bell, right? The same verse used by rabbinic sources to inculcate piety is also used for the purposes of health, healing, and what we might term as magic. And I don't think that there is a true discrepancy between those two categories, certainly not in the ancient world. In fact, the use of Psalms in this vein, sort of to navigate life, sort of what we might modernly call or cheekily call the use of Psalms as self-help, is absolutely ever present in the ancient world and in the modern world. What you see in front of you is a snippet, or at least a collation of a text called Sefer Shimush Tehillim. Sefer Shimush Tehillim is more like a magical tradition than a magical text that begins in late antiquity and continues throughout the Middle Ages. The book is arranged as follows. You'd have a psalm, and then, or an incipit of a psalm, and then the text would go on to say what one uses this text for, right? So for psalm, protection against miscarriages. Sometimes these texts would be combined with prayers. Sometimes these texts would be combined with other magical practices. Spreading olive oil on yourself, boiling a pot of water and dumping it at the gate of your enemies. It seems that the Psalms in particular developed this entire, again, ritualistic, what we might call magical, but I would prefer just ritual tradition, which gathered together practice and performance to navigate all aspects of life. There's an interesting Christian parallel to this in Christian Arabic called the Lal al-Mazmir, Mazamir. But it's a pretty common and pretty well entrenched practice among Jews, and I mean Christians had their own version, and it's a practice that still continues to this day. What you see in front of you right now is, interestingly enough, it's the 2 pages that I copied from the very, very recent Rabbinical Council of America Siddur that was published in 2018. So if one were to walk into an Orthodox Jewish synagogue space, the sort of standard Siddur, the standard prayer book that you would find is this. And in the back of this particular prayer book, one has what I would venture to say is a modern version of Midrash, of Shimush Tehillim. So a little less on the magical, or what I would call the magical, a little more on the pietistic. It's not a reproduction of Shimush Tehillim as much as a modern attempt to read the Psalms literarily and then plug them into how they might be used today. So, you can, and it really does truly speak to a range of traditions: personal petitions for depression, for shame, slander, piety, long life, all of which is to say the practices that are rooted in antiquity are still very much alive in modern expressions of Judaism and certainly modern expressions of Christianity as well. So let me wrap up. What can we learn about ancient psalm culture from the perspectives of materiality and performativity? First, that psalm culture exists in ancient Judaism and early Christianity. 2, that exegesis and its manifold assumptions play a central part in its spread. As much as in my talk today I highlighted performativity and materiality, it would be unjust and unfair to say that exegesis plays no role. Of course it did. For Christians in particular, the fact that the Psalms were related to Jesus was crucial and central. And for Jews, that David and his imprint shapes the meaning of the Psalter is absolutely inescapable. But at the same time, we also have to recognize that the physical medium of the Psalter shapes his message then as now. In fact, there are multiple online versions of Sefer Shimush Tehillim, and there's a practice in certain circles to say psalms for healing, and using various text systems, so WhatsApp. So I would say Psalm 1 as part of this group to pray for person X, and after I finish Psalm 1, I say I've concluded Psalm 1, and then someone continues with Psalm 2, and it goes around and around and around. Sort of the digital use of Psalms, which is in some ways the most modern medium in which people are encountering the Book of Psalms. And of course, many and perhaps most Jews and Christians, especially those who are not elite, right? Those who are not necessarily literate, those who weren't necessarily invested in textual interpretation, likely encountered Psalms and developed a Psalm culture through various dimensions of its performance, through what I'm going to call magic, piety, and liturgy. And I'd like to conclude with circling back to my mother, and in particular, to show the imbrication of all these three elements, the exegetical, the material, and the performative. What you see in front of you right now is the Psalm book that my mother most recently used for the final years of her life. And we can see the sort of movement or the combination of materiality and exegesis and performance. On the left, you see the book is 4 by 6 inches and weighs 0.6 pounds. It's a small book. You can hold it in a hand and you can flip through it. You could put it in a bag and read it on a train. If you open up the first page, you can see all the various paratextual indicators that instructs towards interpretation as well as piety, right? This is Psalm 1, but it's the first book of Psalms. It's the first day of Psalms, so you would read this on Sunday, and the book is then divided according to each day of the week. I can guarantee you that my mother probably had no idea which psalm ended which day. She likely relied on these paratextual clues to know exactly when to end. There's also a monthly reading cycle, and of course, the Hebrew text and English translation with various paratextual elements that frame the text in terms of piety. Begins with a guide itself, as well as interpreting the Psalms as David, when David was anointed as God's king over Israel, etc., right? So we can sort of see the combination of the exegetical, of the material, and the performative in the way that at least my mother and the very, very, very countless others like her who engaged in this Psalm cultural pursuit. Thank you very much. I'm excited for our Q&A. I'm looking forward to learning from you. All of this material, or at least parts of it certainly, come from snippets of my book. If you're interested in today's talk, shameless plug, you can buy the book at the University of Pennsylvania website for a 30% discount with the code Berkovitz30. I look forward to our time together via Q&A. Thank you so much.
AJ, thank you very much. That was very, very interesting and splendid. AJ, can you say a little bit more about the role of orality? Because I understand what you're saying about the psalm culture and about the idea of saying certain psalms for certain, to get better, or your child get better and all the rest of it. But doesn't that presume that there was some memorization going on as well? Because not everybody could read, and also the production of texts were extremely expensive, as we all know. So how do we weigh up this question? Because you said, we mustn't imagine that everybody knew the whole Bible by heart. On the other hand, it took time before the Talmud was written. Can you say a little bit more about that whole issue?
Absolutely. So I think we need to divide the question into sort of two segments. There are the people who are designed to memorize the Psalms, and then there's the everybody else. And unfortunately, as things go with the ancient world, we have more evidence for the former, less evidence for the latter, but we can intelligently speculate about the latter. So when it comes to, as much as I quip that, rabbis didn't memorize biblical text, it's clear that rabbis memorized some biblical texts. Certainly key psalms among them, and it's absolutely true for the monastic community, right? The Pachomian, starting with the Pachomian monks in Egypt were required to memorize the Psalter, if not large sections of it, to even have the ability to become monks in the first place. And the educational system in the Eastern Christian world, right? So Syriac Christianity began with studying the Book of Psalms. So to the degree that you have anyone that is tangentially elite, it really seems that among the earliest texts they would study, and study in the ancient world is also oral, right? Where this is people did not, it's not like we today. They didn't have books and sit and the teacher reads, right? It's a teacher might have a text in front of them, but they're reading and reciting together. So there's good evidence both in Christian sources and in early Jewish sources. This is in chapter 4 of my book. If you want exact details, that early education for both Jews and Christians began with Psalms. So for starters, the text that these communities were memorizing to begin with was sections of the Psalms, which then leads us back to that larger question of like the everybody, sort of everybody else. If you, in the ancient world, if you're hearing a text again and again and again, unlike the modern world, we kind of just segment it aside because we really have our reading material. You start, if anyone here has toddlers and has had toddlers and listened to that same Wheels in the Bus song again and again and again and again, you might flip a version, but you know it. I promise you, you know it. So if you're hearing these texts in various contexts again and again and again, they are being recited orally, but you also then begin to start internalizing them.
Yeah.
It's kind of the way, I mean, similar to the way sort of religious Jew, anyone of religion has their like tag phrase at the end of a word, God bless you, Deo volente, if God wills it, inshallah, right? It's often subconscious, but you've heard it enough and you've internalized it. So that, I hope, and that's where the orality comes into play, right? For the most part, absolutely, this is an orally inflected world, both for those who are elite and for those who are, I don't like the word elite, but I've been using it anyway, for those with less privileges and opportunities.
I'm also very interested in a later period in how Christians and Jews use the same texts, and indeed how they don't just interpret them, but how they experience texts, biblical texts. So I very much share your interest in that. But I just wonder to what extent that binds people together when the use of some texts, they might be sharing the experience of using texts, but that doesn't mean that they use and experience those texts in the same way. And I'm thinking in particular, in Christianity, the Sanctus, holy, holy, holy. And if you think then on the Jewish side, on the Kedusha, and they are such different experiences. So can you say a little bit more about your view of this sharing in terms of interfaith and how that might be different in different periods?
To best frame the point that I made, we might have to go back a bit and understand sort of the shadow that I'm fighting against, right, so to speak, right, which is the sort of Origen and the rabbis model. Origen said, the rabbis said. And that's the only place where we can begin to think about sites of late ancient interaction. At the very, I can now, to the actual shared experience, there are two arguments I can make, a weak version and a strong version. I'll make this weak version first, and then I'll make the strong version. The weak version of the argument is that what this evidence that I gather and point to show that both Jews and Christians are fundamentally not same, but belong to the same cultural atmosphere of late antiquity. As in, these are, don't think about the identity category of Jew and Christian as the central vector upon which to understand their relationship to to scripture, I mean. Instead, they are people living in late antiquity who engage with sacred texts in modes that begin to align with one another. That's a very different argument than, and therefore they experience the text the same way, right? Which is why I think it's partly why I think we can't totally abandon exegesis, beyond it for sure, but not so far beyond it, because absolutely, for when monks are, and you have this in the life of Simeon the Stylite, who's runs away from the monastery and goes renegade. Gets one of his partners going, but you'll never learn the orders of the monks. And he says, don't worry, like David, God taught David the Psalms, he'll do the same for me. I'm paraphrasing, but the framing of the relationship as a new David and as a new Christ is going to be different if you're a Jew or a Christian. But the weak argument is that it presents us with fundamentally similar mechanisms. The stronger argument to make is that those mechanisms then encourage us to think about finer ways in which we can view similarity and difference.
Yeah.
So of course, the experience won't be the same, but individuals' experience of using the Psalms won't be the same. I mean, we're historians, we're not psychologists. We're never going to get to that layer. And I don't think these two communities overlap in existentially similar ways, but they functionally do, and that's important.
That's very interesting. Well, maybe then to finish, AJ, can you just say why the Psalms? Why the Psalms the most popular? What is it about Psalms?
I just gave a whole presentation about
I
them.
know you did, but just say it in a sentence.
In a sentence. I'll be cheeky, because you can't escape them.
Fair enough.
And in multiple senses, because A, they are everywhere, but also the text itself. And this is something I didn't talk about in the presentation, but I'll leave everyone here with now. Part of what makes the Psalms really plastic is its language, right? It's not Habakkuk. It's not a historical text. The anonymous I's and the we's in the Psalms encourages its readers to fill the gap with themselves, which again, partly explains, at least on a literary level, why you can't escape them.
Right, so the teenager was wrong.
Surprise, surprise, the teenager was wrong. Who would have thought a teenager being wrong?
Well, thank you so much for giving us this very interesting talk. And yes, let's all show our appreciation. You can actually hear my appreciation. Thank you so much. And I have been reading the book and I do recommend it very strongly. So thank you and good night. No, good morning, good afternoon, good night to wherever you are in the world. And thank you. And thank you to Taya for organizing everything.